to introduce Karl Wegmann, who's today's speaker. Karl hails from the Pacific Northwest from Washington State. He got his undergrad there at Whitman College, and then he went to the University of New Mexico for his master's, and then he spent 5 years at the Washington State Survey before taking his PhD in Lehigh in Pennsylvania, and then in 2008, Karl joined us here at NC State as a professor. Karl's talk today is going to be on the use of geospatial data, the likes of Lidar and things like that, to help understand faulting and earthquakes, and particularly structures that otherwise weren't easily visible without those kinds of data available in the Pacific Northwest. And there's an element of fish in there that I don't understand, and therefore I'm looking forward to seeing how that works in the talk as well. So without further ado, Karl Wegmann.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me today. And I've changed the title on you a little bit from what was advertised. Hopefully that's okay. So we're going to go on an adventure, and it's mostly going to be out in Washington State, which is what I want to talk to you about today. And we're going to try to get in some mostly about topography, faults, earthquakes, geologic hazards, and how those things and how earthquakes and landslides can rearrange topography and landscapes, and then how that might relate to fish. So when I first thought, when John Vogler asked me if I'd give this talk, and over the summer I was thinking about what am I going to talk about, what should the title be, and at first I came up with this title called Earth First, We'll Log the Other Planets Later, Digital Lidar Removal for Vegetation for Earth Surface Processes and Hazards Research. To me, that was maybe a little funny and witty. Maybe to others it's not. I realize so I thought, well, maybe I'll take a little opportunity to try to explain myself. I'm a geologist, and I'll go into where I grew up, which is part of this story in a moment. But as a geologist and someone who's ultimately interested in the subfield I'm in is geomorphology. So I'm interested in landscapes and the Earth's surface and processes that generate topography and processes that tear the topography down, landslides, rivers, glaciers, right? So for me, looking across a landscape like this with a lot of trees, and I know I've come up 3 floors, and I'm now in the College of Natural Resources. So I understand there's people who love trees, love vegetation. I like trees too, except for it'd be so nice if like all the landscapes were like this over here without any trees, and we could just see the Earth's surface exposed. That's sort of where this title came up, right? So, okay, so here's the part of the world I grew up in Western Washington. It looks like this: forested hill slopes. Pretty much everything in the landscape is a hill slope. And that's true everywhere in terrestrial environments. How many of you got up this morning and thought, geez, I'm going to be traversing across hill slopes most of my day today? Awesome. Yeah, it's not really something we think about all that much, but I kind of like to remind myself that really I'm kind of in the hill slope business. I'm in how is topography forming, and what are these processes that are tearing it down, right? So I had this little thing I say in the geomorph class with the undergrads. If it's not a river or a beach or a lake, and you're up above the ocean, you're on a hill slope. And one of the processes that happens on hill slopes are landslides, so I'm particularly interested in those as geomorphic and geomorphic processes and geologic hazards. We'll get into landslides in a bit. And so I put that little primer on hill slopes because it is Halloween. Thank you for being dressed up. It's Halloween. Oh, and over here too.
Excuse me, this is a costume.
Oh, and there. Yeah. It was awesome. Okay, it's Halloween. There's 3 costumes. I have 3 chocolate bars. You guys are the winners. Okay. All right. And we're going to be talking a little bit about sediment moving down hill slopes pretty rapidly later in the talk during big landslides. But I thought it might be, because it's Halloween, it might be appropriate to talk about creek-dominated hill slopes, which is a term how sediment moves down hill slopes by creeping, right? Really slowly, but friend of mine made this a couple years ago and sent it to me, and I just thought it was cute. And now it's finally Halloween, and I can show this. So, thank you. All right, that has nothing to do with the rest of the talk. But all right, so there's a fundamental relationship between plate tectonics and topography, and I think no matter how many or how few geology classes you've had, you realize that the plate tectonics is an active planet that we live on, and places where plates are colliding together or pulling apart or grinding next to each other, kind of active margins or collisional margins, we call them, are places where we're creating new topography, right? Either through faults pushing rocks up above the geoid or above sea level, or volcanoes injecting magma into the crust or erupting stuff up onto the surface. We're creating new topography. And then if we come over to a coastline where we are here on the Atlantic side, much more of a passive continental margin, right? And we're mostly dominated by erosional processes, those processes that help to wear down topography, right? These gravity-driven processes. Okay, so as a primer, right, we can look at the digital topography of North America. Everyone knows where we are, right? Okay, over on this side. What's the main difference when you look at North America from the topography of the United States? Oh, come on. Yeah, there's a lot of elevation differences, right? Lots of high, maybe if we think about topographic wavelength, there's a lot higher frequency of topography kind of bouncing around over here in the western part of the United States than certainly in the middle portion. And here we are, we've got this fantastic mountain range here, a couple hours, I've been told 3 hours to our east. No. West. Yeah, it's that directional dyslexia, it gets me every time. Right, so was an active mountain range 250, 300 million years ago, no longer, but that topography persists. We still have landslides and debris flows that occasionally kill people in these mountains. That's another story for another day. So you'll have to invite me back at some point and we'll talk about those processes in the Appalachians. But really what I want to talk about today are seismic hazards. And the seismic hazards, I guess the reason I put this underneath this slide was sort of to say, here's this topography. Ultimately, tectonics is creating this topography. Part of that are active faults and their associated earthquakes. And if we look at the seismic hazard map for the United States, warm colors equal higher seismic hazard potential than cool colors. Probably no big surprise. You've all seen things like this, right? California, the Pacific Northwest are areas that lots of kind of active faults. We're building topography or moving topography around on these faults, and there's an associated hazard. So we're going to go spend some time up here in the Pacific Northwest thinking about earthquake hazards and the topography up there and associated landslides that are being caused by earthquakes. Okay, so when I first started putting this talk together, a couple days ago, it said today's story was going to consist of 3 acts. But then a very smart PhD student came to me this afternoon and said, dude, you like to talk too much. You cannot have 3 acts. So it was going to be Act 1 here in the Pacific Northwest, Act 2, Grand Mesa and kind of evolution of topography in the Colorado Plateau, and then over here in the Appalachians. Those are going to have to be different talks for another day because I just can't do it. But it is my shameless pitch to let you know that students and colleagues, we're working on using digital topography to interrogate landscapes. I'll show you stuff up here, but also in other parts of North America. I love digital topography, and if at the end of this class, or of this discussion seminar, if you are using digital topography in your own research, especially for students in the room, if you want to chat about that at any point, come find me. I'm on the 2nd floor of Jordan Hall. Okay, how many people use Lidar in their research? Everybody, pretty much everybody knows what Lidar is, right? So just a really quick primer. And in my case, I'm talking about airborne Lidar, right? This can be collected from an airplane. And I found this video. So the airplane flies around, it's shooting laser pulses down to the ground, it's measuring the return, and that's used to generate surface models. What's the elevation of whatever the LiDAR's bouncing off of? Canopy, trees, buildings, the ground surface, right? Have you guys seen this? I'm from Wikipedia. I just stole it. Okay, and so here's this airplane flying through over the jungle in the Amazon, and then they do this fly through the canopy, right? So the LiDAR is collecting all this information about the canopy, mostly in this case, not about so much about the Earth's surface. Maybe a few laser points are hitting the ground surface. One of our PhD students, Julian Nutman Chestnut, who's not here today, had a career in the Air Force. He was an F-16 pilot before he retired and decided that playing with digital data sets like this would be more fun. And Julian will say that stuff that gets shot out of the back of an airplane is called chaff, right? Like you're trying to, so for me, this is sort of digital chaff. Like all these leaves, and I don't mean to offend anyone because I know maybe there's some folks that are interested in like structure of canopies or whatever, but for me, I want to get rid of all that stuff. I want to see what's underneath, right? So here's LiDAR data from Northern California. In this image here, this is like the first returns, and it's colored by elevation. So the darker the color means the higher the trees. The greens are vegetation, so you can see how much vegetation's on this landscape, right? And then we can digitally process that, use the last returns, and create a surface terrain model or digital elevation model of the bare earth, right? And that's, so that for me, that's what we're really interested in. And this is why. So this is a little bit of a background on my personal story, because I think our stories are all important in terms of directing where we end up and where we go in life. So I grew up outside of a small town called Port Angeles. Has anybody been there before? Yeah, okay.
Somebody over there has.
Oh, yeah.
If you haven't, maybe most people go to Port Angeles because they're trying to get to or come from Victoria, British Columbia, which would be just up here, right? So that's the main reason you'd stop in Port Angeles, unless you really like trees. We have a lot of them. So prior to the development of LiDAR, and I'm old enough that I predate that, at least for kind of Earth surface process research, I'm not sure I ever really observed, I have this little thing in here, right? I'm not sure I ever really observed the true surface of the Earth growing up, because it was always covered in vegetation. And that would be true, I think, if you grew up in the well, sometimes it's kind of true around here, if you grew up in the mountains of the southern Appalachians, you're not that much bare ground actually exposed, except for when they did clear cuts. And I used to work in the summers in college. I worked for a logging company as a summer job. I loved going to see these clear cuts in these places because it was sort of like revealing what was like giving your dog a haircut. You kind of step back and all of a sudden your dog looks different, right? So now the landscape looks different when you remove that hair or giving oneself a haircut. Okay, so LiDAR has allowed us to do sort of digital clear cuts, and that's really where I came up with that original title, Earth First will log the other planets later. It was kind of the digital clear cutting used through LiDAR for Earth surface process stuff. Okay, so I grew up in Port Angeles, went off to college, went to New Mexico, and then got a master's degree, and then lived in my parents' basement for 4 or 5 months trying to find a job. Anybody have that experience? Like, you guys are better than I was. Yeah, okay. All right, so good times. Eventually ended up getting a volunteer position with the Washington State Survey, saying I've got 6 years of geology training. I just need to get some experience under my belt. So started out as a volunteer mapping what's called a 7.5-minute quadrangle. Everyone know about USGS topo sheets, right? Okay, so a standard map that geology groups make are mapping the Earth at that 1 to 24,000 scale, or 7.5-minute quadrangle. The Washington State Geologic Survey was making maps up along the North Olympic Peninsula. This was sort of a target area for them. My parents, I think I have that on here. Okay, so I was living in the basement of this house here, and I could drive over and help out the geologists who was mapping this quadrangle in the summer of 1999, and after a few weeks, I think he felt sorry for me and decided that, give me a small salary, and that began my career at the State Survey for the next 5 years. The reason I put this simplified geologic map up here, what I want to show you, the dark line, so this is the Olympic Peninsula, Seattle would be right over here. The dark lines on here are faults, right? And faults are discontinuities between different rock units, and at that where the different blocks of rock have moved relative to each other. Now there could be faults. We have faults all over around us, beneath our feet all the time. Some of them here may be hundreds of millions of years old. Others of them may be active. Well, here they're not hundreds of millions of years old because the Olympic Peninsula didn't exist that long ago. But in Raleigh, there may be faults that are 300, 400, 500 million years old that haven't moved since then. In an environment like this, we knew that there were faults. We could map discontinuities in the rocks across those faults, but nobody had an idea that they were active or potentially capable of producing earthquakes at the Earth's surface. And so this is just my little kind of acknowledgement to the folks who did the original geologic mapping. This is the original geologic map for the Olympic Peninsula done in 1960. It was an oil and gas investigation map. And they had identified these faults, and here's one of them, and there again is my parents' house. So if you'll notice, the basement I was living in for those couple months is right on one of these faults. So I started becoming kind of aware of the geology of the surroundings where I grew up once I came back from grad school and was living in their basement and was doing this job for the State Survey. Certainly, folks have known that there are earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest region for a long time, and those earthquakes are sourced in 3 different places. The Pacific Northwest is an active plate margin. Sorry, I can't look at the screen because of the glare. All I see are the buildings in the back. So I know this is kind of a timeout tangent, but it's okay for you guys if I talk off that one? Okay. Okay, so there's three different earthquake sources. It's the Juan de Fuca plate is subducting beneath North America, right? So we can generate the really big earthquakes, these mega thrust events happen on the subduction interface, on the Cascadia subduction interface. This would be the subduction zone. Those are up to magnitude 9. They'd be like the Tohoku earthquake, which happened in 2011 in Japan, something like that. Big earthquake, big tsunami, shaking that goes on for minutes. We also have had historic earthquakes that happen on the subducting oceanic plate or within the subducting oceanic plate that's descending down beneath North America. And these are known as locally deep Juan de Fuca earthquakes. I lived through one in 2001, which is locally known as the Nisqually or the Olympia earthquake, magnitude 6.8. So there have been 3 of these in the last 50 plus years, 1949, 1965, 2001. And these cause a decent amount of damage. So the Nisqually earthquake caused about $2 billion worth of mostly structural damage to buildings and infrastructure, and 1 fatality from someone who had a heart attack, and the telephone lines to 911 were jammed and they couldn't get emergency services to that person. We also know that, or we anticipate that there are what are called crustal faults, that earthquakes that are embedded in the on faults in the North American plate. These are ones that when they rupture right up potentially to the ground surface and cause displacement of the Earth's surface. And so these ones, while they're both magnitude 7 maybe for deep earthquakes and the crustal ones, these crustal ones are sourced essentially right underneath our cities and our infrastructure, and the energy, instead of traveling 50, 60 kilometers through the crust before it reaches the Earth's surface, it's sourced essentially right at the Earth's surface or a few kilometers beneath. And so there's the potential damage from these earthquakes, while the magnitude may be the same, is potentially quite a bit bigger. Okay, so we've known about, let's see, the only ones that have happened in historic time is maybe a crustal earthquake back in eastern Washington in 1872. We'll talk about this one in 900 AD. There was no one living in this portion of Western North America that had a written language in 900 AD, so we don't have historical accounts. And then the subduction zone earthquake in 1700, the same thing. That one is recorded in historical documents from the tsunami it generated in Japan. So we need to increase our understanding of the number and how often and where are these earthquakes likely to happen. In the early 2000s, LIDAR came along, right? Okay, so we're going to do a little exercise. So for example, this is a small island just west of Seattle. It's called Bainbridge Island. If you're in Seattle and you ride the ferry, or if you watch the Seahawks games, because they're the best football team ever, and I'm sure you all watch the Seahawks, and they always have a aerial shot with the ferry going, like in the foreground, you know, and then I don't know what that was. Anyways, that was me cheering for the Seahawks. So, okay, so anyways, so the ferry goes back and forth between Seattle and Bainbridge Island. This is the southern part of Bainbridge Island. Where's the fault? Who sees it?
Is that a little curved section up towards the middle of the island?
Yeah.
No, come down a little bit. And just to the right of that subdivision towards the tip.
Oh,
Right in, no, it's right about there coming down.
like here? Curved?
No, I'm just coming straight down.
Oh, okay, so the fault's going to be going east-west.
Okay.
That's okay, that's good. All right, that's the whole point. This is what the Earth's surface looked to us before LIDAR. I mean, geologists running around, it's a jungle. It's a temperate rainforest jungle. You just can't see the ground. You're often not walking on it. There's the fault. Okay. If we use LIDAR, and this is a really cool image made by the cartographers at the Washington State Survey, where they blend some of the ortho photography in with the hill-shaded LIDAR. Now you can see that discontinuity, right? That topographic discontinuity coming through here. Here's the earthquake fault. These north-south topography, this is glacially striated and formed bed forms. So glacial at the Cordilleran and ice sheets coming out of British Columbia, and it's flowing south, and it's kind of sculpting this landscape, so you get this really strong north-south grain to the topography. In Puget Sound, most of the faults run more or less east-west, so they cross-cut that glacial topography, so we can use that as evidence that this fault, which is known as the Seattle Fault, has ruptured since the time that the glaciers receded about 14,000 years ago. And in this case, we know now from other work, mostly scientists with the USGS, that there's been 7 meters of offset on this fault. So that's over 20 feet during one earthquake. So the Earth's surface, right, you're standing there within 60 seconds, you're either 20 feet higher or 20 feet lower. If you happen to be right here, that would cause some problems. It also offsets the floor of Puget Sound. What happens when you displace a big body of water essentially instantaneously? You generate a tsunami. All right, so there was a tsunami in Puget Sound that was generated by this event. And probably from my perspective, most importantly, okay, so there's the fault. If we look a little bit, so here's the southern part of Bainbridge Island. If we look a little further to the west, that fault runs right underneath downtown Seattle, right? And I know you all love your Starbucks. You love Microsoft and their products. Yes. You all like Amazon Instant Delivery or whatever, right? Like all these, yeah, it's all there. But most importantly, it's where the Seahawks play. And the Sounders and the Mariners, who cares about them? Anyways, okay, so yeah, so this LIDAR topography allowed us as geologists and folks interested in geologic or natural hazards to start saying, whoa, we know there's these faults, but many of them have created surface displacement since the time of glacial retreat. That LIDAR was collected in 2002. Here's a paper that came out in 2003 in a little geology publication called GSA Today. Let's see, the first author was Ralph Hagerud, the USGS at University of Washington. High resolution LIDAR topography of the Puget Lowland, Washington, a bonanza for earth sciences. And that is totally true. So here's, let's see, this would be the same fault we were looking at, and then if you continue over to the west, you can see where the surface has been displaced by that fault on the next peninsula over, and just continues, and you can see the same glacial striations and stuff, right? So this started allowing people to go out and identify these things on the LIDAR and then go find them on the ground and figure out how often they rupture, how big the potential earthquakes might have been in the past, how big they're going to be in the future. So here's kind of coming forward. Here's now a map of all the faults that have known to have ruptured the Earth's surface in the Puget Sound region in the last 14,000 years, since the glaciers melted away and kind of reset that landscape. And so we're going to, so I kind of, we were just looking down here on the Seattle Fault Zone. Here's Bainbridge Island. We were down there. Now we're going to move up to the northern part of the Olympic Peninsula, and I'm going to share with you some information, some data we've been collecting up here. Okay, so we're going to go up here. The town, as we talked about before, is Port Angeles. So in 2002, the state of Washington and the USGS collect LIDAR for much of Puget Sound and the north part of the Olympic Peninsula up to about Port Angeles. Here's this 2002, here's the digital surface model. So here was the LIDAR collection area. At this time in 2003, I'm working for the State Survey. I've been there about 3 years. And they said, hey, we want to do, when I first started, I was volunteering. We were mapping this area over here, this quadrangle. They said, we're going to map 2 more quadrangles, the Port Angeles and the Elwha quadrangles. Would you like to be involved? We hear your parents have a basement that you can live in for free and we don't have to pay for an apartment. And I said, sure, I'd love to do that. That'd be awesome. Get to go work on the geology where I grew up. The LIDAR comes out, and it's like, oh my gosh, look what we missed when we did that map back in, when we did this mapping a couple years before. And one of the things we missed was, well, we'll look at this. Okay, so we're going to zoom in here, back to my basement. Okay, so here's the digital surface model overlying an orthophotograph, right? And so this is a pond, and where there's water, right, there's no returns from the LIDAR, so you're seeing kind of the green, I don't know, algae and some weeds and the water there in the pond, and you can see the structure in the trees, right? So this is like the first returns. Anybody see? Oh, there's about my parents' house. Okay, now here's the last return, the bare earth model for this place, and you might look at this and say, it looks kind of a lot of sort of triangular facets. It looks a little pixelated. I've seen LIDAR that's way better. I agree. Remember, this is early days, right? Like 2002. It's not maybe one
point every 2 meters or
something like that. Yeah, not multiple points per meter for sure, like we have now. Okay, do you notice any topographic features of interest? There's a roads. You can see the roads, right? Faults are mostly running east-west. You see any fault in here? Any subtle hint that maybe the surface has been displaced? There's the fault. I didn't put a scale bar on here. That's about 100 meters. So I spent like most of my life, the first 18 years of my life in a basement, plus a couple months later, like right on top of this fault. And that was a little disconcerting. Now so I showed this to my parents, like, check this out. You guys are living on a fault. And it's like, oh my God, do we need to buy earthquake insurance? I'm like, well, I don't know. How do we know? So, all right, so we'll zoom out a little bit. That last slide was where the little white polygon or rectangle is. We'll zoom out a little bit. Can you see the feature now? This sort of very faint sort of linear feature running across the landscape. Okay, so let me highlight it there. Okay, so this is where there's surface rupture along this fault zone that my parents happen to live right on top of. And so like the ones in Puget Sound and this one here, this got geologists exciting because it's kind of job security, right? If there's nothing, if you're into the earthquake business and you can't find active faults, then what are you going to do? So this is job security for folks at the State Survey. It's job security for folks at the USGS. We're going to go out and investigate these faults. We're going to do some paleoseismology. We're going to trench these faults. We're going to figure out how often they ruptured and how big the earthquakes might have been in the past and will be again in the future. So what magnitude might we expect and how best to answer these questions. So the USGS came out and let's see, so that last slide, I should have showed that last, so my parents' house is like right here, that by the letter, just a little west of the letter D. USGS came out, and at that time the LIDAR only extended to about here. And so the USGS came out and they put in trenches across these faults. With a backhoe, they dig a trench across, and then they can look at offset in the stratigraphic, in the sediments, offset in the layers, date those layers using radiocarbon, traditionally, at least in this environment, and then use that to figure out how old those sediments were, how much they've been displaced, what was the timing that they were displaced. And when they did this, they came up with an estimate of 3 to 5 earthquakes in the last, maybe I didn't have that written down, the last 10,000 years. And the fault is slipping at a rate of about 1 to 2 millimeters per year. You may say 1 to 2 millimeters per year, so what? That's not that fast. And I agree, it's not very fast, right? How fast do our fingernails grow? This is like an important piece of information everybody needs to know. About like 30, 35 millimeters a year for your fingernails, okay? So this fault's not slipping that fast. Your fingernails are growing way faster. But because geology is cumulative over time, right? What's 1,000 years to a geologist? It's like, or to Mother Earth, it's just like that, right? So, so a couple thousand years now, if that slip is recaptured during an earthquake event, you get several meters of offset, right? 1 millimeter per year equals a meter per 1,000 years. So you see how that accumulates. This would be kind of an example or a picture of a backhoe trench into one of these faults and looking at the sedimentary units that are exposed and then collecting charcoal or organic material to radiocarbon date. That's not really part of our story. I just wanted to show you how the USGS scientists collected this data, and then I'll present their results compared to ours. We're going to go to this nice, pretty lake over here called Lake Crescent to do our work here in just a minute. Okay, so the LIDAR allows for about 20 kilometers of surface rupture over here along this fault, which is known as the Lake Creek Boundary Creek Fault, since 20 kilometers of surface rupture. We can see that in the LIDAR. We can go out now and find it in the field. In 2015, the state collected LIDAR. This is Lake Crescent, which is Olympic National Park. This is the boundary of the LIDAR survey. For some reason, no one wants to pay to collect LIDAR data in at least this national park, which I think is a tragedy that should be fixed. So write your congressman, or if you know anyone from Washington State. But the state of Washington, that owns all the timberland around, is really keen on having LIDAR phones. So they flew that in 2015. Do you see the fault in this image? Something like that. If I take it away, can you see that really faint line? Okay, now the quality, now we have multiple points per square meter and the bare return, much higher quality LIDAR by 2015. Okay, so there's our fault. Okay, so then let me just zoom in to show you just one or two more, because the talk's supposed to be about LIDAR. So here's the trace of this fault right here, and we can start using things like these little stream channels that have been offset by that fault to figure out how much displacement has happened along that fault. So here's the trace of the fault, and we can start to reconstruct how much it's slipped if we know the timing. Okay. Let's see. So putting this all together, then, so now we know in 2000 we knew that there were faults in the North Olympic Peninsula. We've known that for many decades, but we didn't know that any of them could generate earthquakes. Now we know that there's a really big one. It's called the Lake Creek Boundary Creek, and then what we've labeled the Sadie Creek Fault, that have surface rupture and they're capable of generating earthquakes. Okay, and so the USGS and the state of Washington takes this information and they make seismic intensity models, which show, okay, here's a fault. This would be our Lake Creek Boundary Creek Fault near Port Angeles. The fault is this long. From our paleoseismic trench studies, we know that it slips on average about 1 meter or 2 meters per earthquake, whatever the amount might be, and then we can estimate the amount of, or the perceived shaking intensity at different distances away from that fault. And so very severe would be in orange here, and then it dissipates away. The longer a fault is, the greater the rupture length, typically the bigger the earthquake. So this fault scenario was based on data before the 2015 LIDAR came out. Now we know that this fault extends another 15, 20 kilometers in this direction, which would allow us to increase the magnitude of potential rupture based on, there's some scaling relationships between the length of a fault and the size of the earthquake that is capable of generating. So that'd be a decent magnitude 7 earthquake up on the North Olympic Peninsula. Okay, so we're going to go, but we really don't know how often these events happened and what did they do to kind of the local landscape when they did happen. So we're going to focus in, and this is work I've been doing with Del Bonesteel and Lonnie Leifold in Marine Earth and Atmospheric Sciences and a number of graduate and undergraduate students. We're going to go to this really cool lake. It's in an Olympic National Park. It's called Lake Crescent. So are you with me? Can we go on a virtual field trip to Lake Crescent?
Go.
Okay, cool, awesome. And so we're going to, instead of digging trenches into the fault with a backhoe, we're going to use the sediments that have accumulated in this lake as our archive of past earthquakes. So just a little primer on, can I move this thing out of the way? No? We'll put it down over here. Okay, so the lake occupies parts of two sort of east-west trending valleys. It was carved out by glaciers sometime in the last couple million years as glaciers advanced from British Columbia. That's Vancouver Island, that's the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This is the Northern Olympic Peninsula. The ice comes across and then it moves out towards the Pacific and it's scouring out these valleys. And the ice is advancing and retreating on kind of 100,000 year time scales. Okay, 14,000 years ago the ice goes away. We've got this lake that's now 190 meters deep. So it's over 600 feet deep. It's, the bottom of the lake's below sea level. It's about 20 square kilometers in size. It's got about over a kilometer of topographic relief from like where the person who took this picture is standing down to the bottom of the lake. So big steep hill slopes right next to the lake. And it's got these faults that run through it. And I promise you there'd be a fish story even if you wanted to hear it or not. So there's two endemic populations of freshwater fish in this lake. There's a rainbow trout and there's a rainbow and cutthroat trout that are endemic to Lake Crescent. Okay. And so since we're talking about fish, let's look at these fish. So there's one called, the main one we'll focus on is what's known as the Beardsley trout. The Beardsley trout is the local name that's been given to a subspecies of rainbow trout. Everybody know what rainbow trout is? You can buy them in the grocery store. They're commonly farmed. They're endemic. They're not, like here the rainbow trout are introduced in the Appalachians, right? But in the western part of North America, they're endemic. Okay. They're named the Beardsley rainbow trout because we had a Navy Rear Admiral, this guy, Lester Beardsley, who was stationed in Port Angeles like in the late 1800s. And this guy liked to go out to Lake Crescent, and this was like his daily catch. So for some reason, this lake, the fish got really big. So the state records in Washington State for both rainbow and cutthroat come from Lake Crescent. And then here's just a picture of some kids that also caught big fish, big trout out of this lake. Now it's protected in the national park. The national park and scientists that are interested in these fish realized that initially they were described by phenotypic differences, that they were probably a separate species because they're isolated in this lake. And that's been confirmed by genetic analyses, and I'll get to that a little bit at the end. And so now the Park Service and conservation biologists you can no longer fish, and you can fish, but you can no longer keep them anymore, right? They're trying to maintain the population. Okay, and these fish, importantly, they're anadromous. You guys know what that word means? What's an anadromous fish? We thought this was a talk about geology, and there's a College of Natural Resources. So, anadromous they're fish that they spawn in freshwater and then spend part of their life cycle out in the salt water. So these fish initially were anadromous, and then they got isolated in this lake, Lake Crescent. So let me walk you through this story real quickly. I'll set up the fish story, and then we'll come back to it at the end. Okay, so right now, Lake Crescent has one outlet. It drains through what's called the Lyre River out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, out to the saltwater. In the past, it used to be this lake, Lake Sutherland and Lake Crescent, were connected. They were one lake. They were joined together. How are we going to separate two lakes? What geologic process would you do if you were going to split a lake in half?
Landslide.
Landslide, yeah. Okay, cool. So there's some big landslides that came down. We're going to look at those in a minute. So these big landslides came down. They separated the lake, and that caused, so the outlet here of Indian Creek is 24 meters lower than where the Lyre River flows out here. So when these landslides separated Lake Crescent from its former outlet, the lake level rose by 24 meters, okay, until it spilled over a low divide and then flowed out to the ocean. Unfortunately for the fish that were in this basin, they can go out, but they can never come back in. There's a series of waterfalls on the Lyre River that are about 10 meters high to prevent the fish from getting back up into the lake. So the ones that are in the lake, the thought is they used to be anadromous like the other populations in the streams around. They live partly in the salt water and then they spawn in the fresh water. These ones got trapped and now they just spend their life in this lake. Okay, so folks have known for a long time that landslides separated Lake Crescent and Lake Shovelin. Here's a map from a 1991 paper. Here's Lake Crescent, the little squiggly lines represent water. These are a couple different landslides that geologists mapped back in the early 90s, and knowing that we knew for sure that these lakes had been separated by landslides, but nobody knew the timing. And so there were two estimates on the timing. One was, well, these landslides probably happened right after the glaciers receded, which was 14 to 13,000 years ago. And the biologists said, well, that's okay because the fish in Lake Crescent phenotypically, and this time they didn't have the genetics yet, but phenotypically they're different than all the other rainbow trout populations. So we need some amount of time for that to happen. Some geologists went and they looked at old growth stumps on these landslides and they said, well, there's stumps that are 500 years old, so that provides a minimum age for the landslide. So the age range was somewhere between 14,000 years and 500 years. The biologists said, well, we know for sure that the fish have to have been isolated for longer than 500 years, but we don't really know when that isolation happened. Okay, so this is where we're going to come in to the rescue as geologists. And this, we're going to do some lacustrine. We're going to look at sediments, lacustrine lake. So we're going to look at lake sediments and reconstruct the earthquake history along these faults that we just looked at the LIDAR data. We could see that it ruptured the Earth's surface over here, and we know that fault comes right underneath the lake. So we're going to look in the lake for evidence of displacement of the sedimentary layers. And okay, so the important thing, and I'll show you this in a minute, but there's two types of sedimentary event layers that we can see in the stratigraphy of Lake Crescent. And the first one are what we'll call event layer number 1, and that's what we're going to focus on today. These record ruptures of this Lake Creek, Boundary Creek fault zone, or the Sadie Creek fault, which would run right through this upper portion of the lake. Okay, so there's layers in the lake, sedimentary layers that record rupture on that fault. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So let me show you some data. So in 2013 or 14?
12.
No.
Yeah, so.
Time flies. Okay, Del and Lonnie and I had a grant from NSF to study a different lake out on the Olympic Peninsula, and our interest was, what do big earthquakes, when we know there's these big subduction zone earthquakes off the west coast of Washington State, what happens to the hill slopes in a forested drainage basin when these big earthquakes happen? And our hypothesis was that they're going to generate lots of landslides. And so we went to a lake where we thought we would see a record of that recorded in the sediments, where big earthquake, the last one in the year 1700, and then we'd see this sort of drainage basin response through landslides and then movement of that sediment through the fluvial system into a lake that's going to trap that sediment. That make sense? Without seeing a visual, I'm trying to explain. Okay, so we went out there, we rented some equipment, some expensive chirp sonar equipment that pings sound down into the water column. That sound goes into the sediments and bounces back, and we can generate velocity models or maps, cross-sections of the different sedimentary layers as a function of seismic velocity within the lake bottom. So, and I know I just totally butchered that, but Del's going to let it pass. All right. Okay, so we take here's the lake, and we tow the chirp device back and forth across the lake, and we make maps of what the sub-lake, like the subsurface below the bottom of the lake, what those sediments look like, the architecture of those sediments. And there's two things to know. One is that we see, let's see, how is this set up? Okay. We see kind of two packages of sediment. There's this package up here, which is kind of thinly layered material, and then there's these thick packages of seismically, what was called seismically transparent material, where there's no energy return from this package of sediment. We can see that in the western basin over here, and we can see that in the northern basin over here. These are going to be our event layers. Okay, so I guess to go back to the story, we were working in another lake, but we weren't, because of gas in that methane that's accumulated in the sediments of that lake, we were getting really poor returns from the seismic data. So we ended up, on a whim, going to Lake Crescent. We had a few days left on the rental, towing the equipment around in Lake Crescent, and lo and behold, it's got this amazing stratigraphic record in it. And then that kind of leapfrogged into everything else that we're talking about. So we collect that data. A couple years later, we get a grant from the USGS, from the Earthquake Hazards group, to go out to Lake Crescent in collaboration with the National Lacustrine Coring Center from the University of Minnesota. They bring out their coring platform, which is kind of looks like a barge, and you put up a tripod or a frame on top. And then we're going to send down piston cores down into the sediment. So the lake's 190 meters deep, right? We want to get that sediment out from the bottom of the lake so we can look at those layers. And so I'm going to show you a video of how that works. So here's the piston core. Think of this as like a long drinking straw, 10 meters long, so about 30 meters long, 30 feet long. It's like a big aluminum tube, like an irrigation pipe, and it has maybe 600 to 800 pounds of weight on the top that gets lowered down on a winch from in the middle of the coring platform. There's a smaller core called a gravity core. When the gravity core hits the bottom, it's only going to penetrate maybe half a meter or a meter into the sediment. When it penetrates, it causes this tripping arm to go up, and then that releases a little hold on the wire, and the piston core drops like the last several meters down into the sediments, and that 600 to 800 pounds of weight just drives it right into the bottom of the lake, right? And then because there's a vacuum on this, like a piston or a vacuum on the top of this thing, it's sort of like if you put a drinking straw into your soda, put your thumb over the top, you can lift it up and there's still soda in your straw, right? So we can do that, and we can bring it back up to the top and recover the sediment. So instead of me talking for a minute, do you guys want to see a video of, we thought it'd be cool to just stick a GoPro camera. Okay, that wasn't me. We thought it'd be cool to stick a GoPro camera onto the coring device, and the water is really clear in Lake Crescent, so we're down about maybe 50 feet in water depth. Here's the gravity core. It hits the bottom, it tips over, it doesn't quite work, but it releases that tripping arm. Boom. And there's the main core barrel with the weight stack on top that gets driven down into the sediments. All right, so we do this, and then I'll fast forward a little bit. We don't need to watch the whole thing. Then the winch pulls it back up. You can see the tube, the core barrel, and there's a lot of mud on the outside, and hopefully there's a bunch of mud on the inside, and we pull it back up to the ship, or to the barge, and then those cores end up getting sent to University of Minnesota, to the National Lacustrine Coring Lab, and this is work that Lonnie Leithold and her students have kind of, I don't know, pioneered, not the right word, but in our group have taken the lead on. The cores get split open, cut in half, and then photographed, and we can do chemical and sedimentological analyses on these cores. So let me show you, okay, so here's our seismic image from the lake. Here's one of these cores. It represents this portion. We stuck a core down into the sediments here. This on the bottom is an isopac thickness map. So here's our event layer, this seismically transparent layer. If we use all the seismic data and we generate an isopac or a thickness map for that, that event layer is up to almost 2 meters thick in the deep portions of the basins. in the North Basin and the southern basin of Lake Crescent. So 2 meters of sediment that accumulated, we're going to argue, essentially instantaneously. We haven't talked about that yet, but accumulated almost instantaneously. Here's what the stratigraphy of one of these cores looks like. This is about 140 centimeters, okay, so just over a meter. There's a coarse sandy layer at the bottom. So here's the photograph of the core. What this is showing you is both grain size. The red lines are grain size, so and this is microns at the top, so 0.3 millimeters down to 0. Okay, so very fine. So sand to most of the deposit is kind of in the silt and clay size fraction. At the bottom, it's sandy, kind of a fine to medium sand, and then that's this dark area portion of the core. That dark portion of the core also has, let's see, does the mouse work if I move? Yeah, okay, so that also correlates with magnetic susceptibility. So there's a higher magnetic susceptibility of that coarse sand fraction, and that has to do with the geologic units that sand's derived from, which is a story for another day. So we can differentiate different parts of these event layers. We have a coarse sandy layer that we think accumulates really quickly. It's telling us there's higher energy to get coarse sand out into the middle of a lake. And then there's a big portion in the middle that's just all the same grain size, fine-grained, very kind of fine-grained silt. And then at the very top, there's this light-colored clay cap. And this is the sediment that's slowly dropping out of the water column after a disturbance event. So it's the stuff that takes days to weeks to months to drop out of the water column. Okay, so what are we going to call these event layers? Sounds good. I heard it. Megaturbidites. Who likes that word? What's a turbidite? What the heck is a turbidite? The turbidites are underwater turbidity, like underwater density flows. So think of them like kind of like an underwater landslide, but it's more fluidized. But you have dense sediment that's moving down an underwater slope, and then as the slope decreases, that flow loses energy. The coarse particles accumulate first, and then you get a fining upward sequence. That's what defines a turbidite. Most turbidites are on the order of centimeters to maybe decimeters in thickness. This one, especially in lakes, we have turbidites that are on the order of meter to meter and a half to 2 meters, so we're going to call those megaturbidites, right, because it sounds better. They sound bigger, more powerful or something. So we've got these megaturbidites, and we can see them in the seismic data. Here's the one we cored through. They're these seismically transparent units. Here's one, here's one, we're calling it A, B, C, D, probable fifth one down below. The punchline is we think each of these is being caused by an earthquake, and where the fault comes underneath the lake, where the fault zone comes underneath the lake, we see disturbance of these layers, folding and offset of these layers, as we expect if that fault is moving after the time that the sediments below were deposited. Okay, so these are all of our cores from the lake. The important thing is that we were able to core 4 different megaturbidites, A, B, C, and D, and they're in these colors: green, blue, red, and yellow. And so these core photographs are arranged from sort of west to east across the lake. The important take-home thing from this is that we can correlate 4 of these events across the lake, and all of these little black numbers are radiocarbon dates that we recovered from organic matter in the core. So now we can put timing to when these events happened. And so we've got 4 events. We think all of them triggered by movement on the Lake Creek Boundary Creek Fault. And the most recent one, this upper green one, based on our dating, happened about 3,000 years ago. Okay, 3.1 Ka or 3,000 years ago. Here, if we take our dating, so on the top here are our megaturbidites A, B, C, and D. over the last 7,000 years. These are the let's see. Okay, time is on the x-axis. 0 would be to the right. So we're looking at the time interval 3,000 or 2,500 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. And these are the these little wiggly lines are the radiocarbon probabilities, age probabilities for the radiocarbon samples we collected in the core for each of the cores. So for megaturbidite A, our estimated age is 3.2 to 2.9 thousand years ago and goes back. So earthquake and megaturbidite in Lake Crescent at 3,000 years ago, one at 4,000 years ago, one at about 5,000, and one at about 7,000 years ago. Okay, how does that compare to the fault trenching record that the folks in the USGS did over on the eastern portion of the Lake Creek Boundary Creek Fault? We're working on the western portion over right at Lake Crescent. And that probably means it's like time for me to finish this story up real quick. Okay, so here's our chronology. Now I've switched, just to make sure you're staying awake, I've switched the time axis, so now time is on the vertical axis. This is the Lake Crescent record, 1, 2, 3, 4 events. They're pretty well constrained in terms of time, right? They're big, oftentimes there's fairly large uncertainties with radiocarbon. This is the time, I don't know why we did this, but our events go A, B, C, D. The USGS events go A, B, C, D. I apologize, I'm sorry. Just, that's the way it worked. Okay, so they see an event about 1,300 years ago that we don't record in Lake Crescent. We both see an event at 3,000 years ago. So this is probably saying the eastern portion of the fault ruptured 1,300 years ago, but there's no evidence that it ruptured underneath Lake Crescent. So what that would mean, the way we would interpret that is that earthquake was probably magnitude 6.5 or something like that. Whereas this earthquake at 3,000 years ago was probably more of like a magnitude 7 to 7.5, because it probably ruptured the entire 50, 55 kilometers of the fault zone. And when we look at Lake Crescent, and what do you notice in terms of the sort of we have 4 events. What do you notice in terms of the spacing between those events? Pretty regular. And then there's this block of time where we haven't had one in the last 3,000 years. And this gets back to my parents' question. They keep asking me, should we buy earthquake insurance? And I kind of looking at them now, I'm like, no, I don't think it's worth it. Don't let them see this video. Right? 'Cause, what's the chance? So we can calculate the probability that based on the average recurrence interval out at Lake Crescent, which is about 1,400 years between these events. And from that, we predict that in the next 50 years, there's about a 1 in 20 or about a 5% chance that an earthquake will happen out at Lake Crescent. May not seem like much, but so do you buy in earthquake insurance on a 1 in 20 chance that in the next 50 years there'll be an event? Guess it depends on how long you think you're going to live and those sorts of things, right? Okay, so that was that part. What produced these megaturbidites? Let's do just one more thing and then we'll end, and then we can talk about fish later. It's kind of a cool story. This is where we get back to. So the LIDAR helped us identify these faults. Then we've come out and we've cored this lake. We've come up with this paleoseismic record. And when we're looking at the topography, of course, unfortunately, right, there's all the national park, they didn't fly LIDAR, but there's still some pretty big landslides that are apparent in even the 10-meter DEM, and you can see them when you walk around in the woods out here. And we collected the equivalent of LIDAR for the bottom of the lake. We collected multi-beam bathymetry data with folks at the USGS. And lo and behold, on the bottom of the lake, there's this beautiful underwater landslide deposit that comes from, we think, this subaerial void where the landslide mass was. Now it's down here at the bottom of the lake. Caitlin Joyner, one of our former students, calculated the area of this and did some raster kind of subtraction and calculation to figure out what the probable volume of that landslide is. It's about 7 million cubic meters of material that's down on the bottom of that lake. That's significant. What happens when a big landslide we think triggered by an earthquake goes into